Have you ever saved someone else's life? How did it happen? Here is the story. Story 1. A few times actually. I pulled a small child out of some strong surf outside FT Lauderdale as I spotted him struggling after stepping off a sandbar, and the lifeguards hadn't seen it. Got him to shore with a lifeguard taking him from my arms to an emergency AV they had. Was told he was alright, just a bit shaken up. Pulled a baby from a rollover wreck after his mom was sideswept by a cement truck. The back window was completely blown out indoors, wouldn't open, so I put a blanket over him, cleared the broken glass as best I could, then cut his car seat from the back seat and got him out right as the engine caught on fire. Thankfully, both mom and baby were OK. Seat belts, people save lives. Topped down a suicidal girl from jumping off a bridge. Never got the full story on what exactly happened, but I believe it involved Estee. Thankfully, she lived and got the help she needed. Pulled 3 kids from the rear of a van after their grandfather lost control and crashed into the side of a semi-trailer. Unfortunately, Grandpa and Grandma didn't make it, but their parents did. I didn't pull them out because they had bad injuries and awaited EMT and fire to extract them. Stopped another person from killing themselves. A friend called me absolutely destroyed because his pregnant girlfriend was killed in a crash earlier that day. I kept him talking and drove to his place where he had a bottle of Jack and his grandfather's Colt Python sitting on the table. I took the gun and quickly unloaded it before putting it back on the table to just hold this broken 6'4" bear of a man while he lived in a worst nightmare kind of situation. Me and my brother-in-law had to hike out into a fairly large wooded area to get 2 young kids that had wandered into it the day before. They were Okas, thankfully. They had packed a small bag with snacks and water, but had to overnight in swampy woods, and were covered in mosquito bites, but otherwise were ok. Had a passenger at the cruise terminal that I was working at drop dead of a heart attack. I gave him chest compression purple. A co-worker grabbed the AED. Thankfully, he survived, but spent some time in the hospital afterwards. I have more, but I think this is enough for now. Story 2. My building has a pool. One day, someone flagged me down in the hallway, coming from the parking garage, and stated, "I think she's drowning." I don't actually remember much of the rest of what happened, but I pieced this together. I looked in and thought she was doing breathing exercises, but sprang into action anyway. I scanned my fob and ran to the deep end. I considered taking my phone out of my pocket or taking my shoes off, but didn't want to waste the time. I jumped in and touched her. A couple weeks before this, someone on Reddit said that a drowning person, if given the chance, would climb you like a Christmas tree. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but when I touched her, she climbed me like a Christmas tree. That's when I knew she was drowning. Anyone else would have been surprised, paused, and then reacted. She just reacted by climbing me. Fortunately, the pool was only up to my neck, or I could have had a bad time. She took in a huge breath, and I felt relief. I didn't know how to do CPR, so if she wasn't breathing, I'd have to learn it on the fly while on the phone with 911. I carried her over to the edge of the pool, and she pulled her head and shoulders up. I jumped up and pulled my phone out to turn it off to minimize moisture damage. I feel bad about that. Then I helped her the rest of the way out of the pool, saw that there was an adult who knew her there to take care of her, and I took off never to see either of them again. Cried in the shower for a long time after the adrenaline wore off. Bonus. Turned out my phone was water resistant. This was 2019, I think, so not all phones were at the time. In retrospect, I think he could have saved her just fine, but he was locked out, and all I needed to do was scan him in. Story 3. Saved my mother's life when I was 18-year-old. It was the last day of school, and my youth group were celebrating with pizza. Just so happened to be at a restaurant directly across the street from my apartment. I could see my apartment from the table we were sitting at. Mid-meal, I suddenly had this lightning bolt of the feeling that I had to go home. Never felt anything like that before or since. I quickly said that I had to leave and ran home. Found my mother screaming on the bathroom floor, clutching her head. Never heard screams like that in my life. I called 911. EMTs and firemen showed up, immediately put her in the ambulance. She was having a brain aneurysm. Our local hospital couldn't do the brain surgery she needed, so she got helicoptered to a city tilled 70 miles south of us. They did the brain surgery. Then she was flown to another city on the mainland. I live on an island and was in the ICU there recovering for till 2 months. Story 4. Buddy wrecked in a motorcycle accident right in front of me and went flying into a ditch about 30 to 40 from the road. I pulled off and started heading to him. Along comes a cop, who hops out and yells at me to stop and go back to my bike. We allegedly were going too fast and didn't see him. My adrenaline was spiked, which probably the reason that prompted me to yell back, "Are fucking blind," and point to the smoke off the side of the road. He turns around, does the all-hell shoulder shrug, hops in his cruiser and calls an ambulance. I'd run down to my buddy and this cop is telling me not to move him. Understandable, except he is face down in a creek. I ignored the cop, go down to him. Cop.O's still screaming at me as I try to flip him. Cop, he could have brain damage or spine damage. You flip him, he could die. Me? If I don't flip him, he drowns and dies anyway. Took about 10 minutes for an ambulance to get to us. The cop never came down to check on him. In fact, he didn't even talk to me again after that. He waited for backup and an ambulance and let them handle the rest of the situation. Story 5. I give myself credit for 3 lives saved. In boot camp, my rack mate told me that he was going to live out the scene in Full Metal Jacket. Suffice to say, I let the SDI know, and he was sent to the medical/chaplain platoon for 2 days. When he came back and graduated right on schedule with us, he told me that I'd saved his life. In combat training, a guy in my platoon was bitten by a brown recluse. I led my fire team up the side of a hill with him, and when he started to faint, I told the other Marines to tend to him while I ran ahead solo to get medical attention brought to him. In a twist of fate that sounds like pure bullshit, but I swear on my life it is true, that guy's wife and sister were killed in a car crash the next day, but he'd survived. At a family dinner, my 85-plus/O step-grandmother-in-law started choking on a potato finger. I figured out what was happening and gave her the Heimlich maneuver and out popped the potato. She lives another 6 years. Story 6. This was when I was a young child. Around age 6, me and my family went to a river resort that sat along a small dam no higher than 10 feet. One evening when I was there, I came across a woman who was face down floating in the water. What I gathered later on is that she had fallen off the edge of the dam and hit her head. Being that young at the time, you really have no idea of what is happening. I had no idea, so I ran to the nearest adult. Seconds later, you see men going into the water and take her on shore of the river and try to duke her. I know the efforts to recuperate her were difficult. It came to a point where a helicopter had to fly in and take her to the hospital. From that point on, what happened to her was a mystery to me, up until I returned to the same resort a decade later and learned she was the wife of the man who owned the resort, and she eventually made a full recovery. I'd like to think that had I not found her at the time I did, that woman very well could have died from her injuries. Story 7. This sorta doesn't count, but I'll tell it anyway. I was born at 24 weeks and 3 days through emergency C-section and weighed 1 pound half oz. It was 11 inches long. I stayed in the NICU for about 3 months. Around the time I was born, my dad's dad was in the hospital across the street dying of colon cancer. I was born in March. One night in April, my dad got the phone call that his dad was dying. So he went up there. After my grandfather died, my dad told my mom he wanted to go see me. When they got there, my ventilator, machine helping me breathe, was gone. They were understandably freaked out and asked a nurse what happened. Apparently, I pulled the tube out, the tube that was taped to my throat. After the 3rd time of me pulling it out, the doctors left it out to see what would happen, and I started breathing on my own. My dad said, "Around what time did this happen?" And the time the nurse said was the exact moment that my grandfather died. So my family has always said that when my grandfather was taking his last breath, I was taking my first breath on my own. Story 8. I have 2. They aren't me, if that's all right. Seeing a lot of others in this technically not me category, so I'm going for it. But they both stuck to me pretty hard. My uncle died trying to protect a couple who was being robbed in a restaurant. Some gangbangers came in and started to harass the people in the restaurant, and guns were pulled. My uncle knew one of the guys since high school and figured he could talk him down from hurting anyone else. No one else got hurt except him. Never got to know him, but heard he was an exceptionally cool dude. My teacher in kindergarten was diagnosed with cancer at a point it was aggressively treatable, but also found out she was pregnant. She needed to get an abortion before she could start any cancer treatments, but she didn't want to have the abortion. The cancer was terminal by the time the baby arrived, and she left behind her husband and 3 children. What hit me especially hard with my teacher is that my family remembered her becoming more easily agitated and stressed at the end of the school year, and we found out after her death from her teacher's aide from that year that it was a